As a gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Vindman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member. So in your testimony and the statements provided, there are a number of terms that have been mentioned. There's FTO, Foreign Terrorist Organization, DTO, Designated Terrorist Organization, narco-terrorists, narco-traffickers, transnational criminal organizations. And so this is complicated even for somebody like myself that spent 25 years in the Army and a JAG Corps advisor. What criteria does Southcom use to determine when a criminal organization or vessel qualifies as a terrorist rather than a law enforcement target? And how do you ensure that this expanding definition does not blur the lines between military operations and traditional counter-narcotics policing?
Congressman, thank you for that, and I appreciate you highlighting the number of definitions. This is 41 days in. I have my cheat sheet because I'm learning the definitions, and specifically my authorities as a combatant commander. I can designate OTOs, and we have designated a number of the other terrorist organizations inside the Southcom area of responsibility. And once they're designated as OTOs, I have the ability to use what we call the CT, the Counterterrorism XORD, to apply different authorities and different capabilities against those threats. So that's where it starts for me as a combatant commander, is OTOs.
So you have the authority to designate terrorist organizations has been delegated down to you from the SecDef?
Per our current XORD delegated by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CT XORD, I go through a process, and the process includes submitting that request up for approval all the way to Sec War and above, and then back down if I choose to designate them OTOs.
Okay, gotcha. Please proceed.
So at the same time, the term DTOs, identified by the President of the United States, is a term we're using now against cartels. Non-state armed groups are now designated as DTOs. Their actions constitute an armed attack against the United States, and the U.S. is in a non-international armed conflict with these DTOs. Any action we take, whether that's enhanced counter-narcotics or a maritime strike, are tied to the DTO definition.
And is that tied to their activity? Like, are they directly participating in hostilities or just on their status?
We base that on the actual definition of a terrorist organization, and we have, it's those armed groups that are impacting a threat to U.S. personnel, a threat to our partners.
So that's hostile act, hostile intent. That's status-based targeting. Is this status-based targeting, or is this, sorry, that's action-based targeting. Is this status-based targeting or action-based targeting?
Congressman, I want to make sure I understand the question, because in the targeting process that we execute right now under the law of armed conflict, we have a certain criteria we go through for the actual targeting process itself. Is that the question, Congressman?
Yeah. Let me because I'm running out of time here. Do you have lawyers that are advising throughout the targeting process, correct?
Absolutely, Congressman.
This exchange occurred during a congressional hearing where Representative Eugene Vindman questioned the commander of U.S. Southern Command about the legal frameworks governing military operations against drug trafficking organizations. Vindman served 25 years in the U.S. Army as a judge, advocate general officer, giving him expertise in military law. The proliferation of designations Vindman cited: foreign terrorist organization, designated terrorist organization, narco-terrorists, narco-traffickers, and transnational criminal organizations, reflects the complex legal landscape governing when military force can be used against non-state actors. Each designation carries different legal authorities and operational implications. Foreign terrorist organizations are designated by the Secretary of State under Section 219 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. His designation triggers legal consequences, including making it unlawful to provide material support to the organization and allowing Treasury to freeze assets. The General's testimony that he can designate OTO, other terrorist organizations, as a combatant commander with approval through the chain of command to the Secretary of Defense and above indicates these designations require high-level approval. The counterterrorism XORD he referenced provides the legal authority for military operations against designated terrorist organizations. Designated terrorist organizations, as the general explained, have been identified by the President as constituting an armed attack against the United States and placing the U.S. in a non-international armed conflict with these organizations. This legal characterization is significant because it determines whether the law of armed conflict, LOAC, applies, rather than law enforcement frameworks. Vindman's question about status-based targeting versus action-based targeting addresses a fundamental legal distinction in targeting law. Status-based targeting allows military force against individuals based on their membership in an enemy force, while action-based targeting requires direct participation in hostilities. Under international humanitarian law, civilians lose protection from attack for such time as they directly participate in hostilities. The general's response that targeting is based on armed groups that are impacting a threat to U.S. personnel, a threat to our partners, using hostile act, hostile intent criteria, suggests elements of both status and action-based approaches. Hostile act and hostile intent are rules of engagement terms that guide when force can be used. The general's confirmation that lawyers are advising throughout the targeting process reflects standard military practice. Under the law of armed conflict, legal advisors must be available to commanders to ensure operations comply with international and domestic law. Vindman's concern about ensuring this expanding definition does not blur the lines between military operations and traditional counter-narcotics policing addresses the fundamental question: when does counter-drug enforcement become armed conflict, and what are the legal implications of that shift? Watch how Vindman's questioning turned to strike statistics and a controversial no quarter statement.
So, and this is from Mr. Humar's testimony, there are 45 total kinetic attacks, killing 157 members, and 47 narco-trafficking vessels. How many survivors in those strikes?
Congressman, so for just to clarify on the designated terrorist organizations, that's
The
illegal.
boat strikes, how many survivors out of the...
I defer the operational aspects to the Southcom, but just if you want me to clarify a little bit, designated terrorist.
No, I just want to know the number. Any sense?
Congressman, I'm tracking the numbers you've offered, and what I'm focused on ever since I took command 41 days ago, then I would have to get back to you in the number of survivors, Congressman. I don't have it in front of me.
Two is my understanding. And so my question is this. We heard Secretary of Defense this weekend talk about no quarter, no survivors. Has an order been issued to you on no quarter, no survivors? General Donovan?
Congressman, that is, no.
No. And would you consider such an order lawful?
Congressman, I'm personally responsible for upholding the core principles of necessity, distinction, proportionality, and humanity, and that's part of my targeting process.
I mean, this is a sort of like basic question. Is a no quarter, no mercy order lawful or unlawful?
Congressman, I would not follow unlawful order.
Okay. Well, that's an unlawful order.
Gentleman's time's expired, Chair, and I recognize.
Vindman's questioning established specific statistics about kinetic military strikes: 45 total kinetic attacks, 157 people killed, 47 vessels destroyed, and according to Vindman's understanding, only 2 survivors. These numbers, if accurate, would indicate an extremely high fatality rate in military operations against drug trafficking vessels. The general's inability to immediately confirm the number of survivors, stating he would have to get back to you, despite being in command for 41 days, raises questions about casualty tracking and reporting. Military operations typically involve detailed after-action reports, including battle damage assessments and casualty figures. Vindman's statement that only 2 survivors resulted from 45 strikes killing 157 people and destroying 47 vessels would represent a survival rate of approximately 1.3%. This extraordinarily low survival rate prompted Vindman's question about whether a no quarter, no survivors order had been issued. The term no quarter has specific meaning under international humanitarian law. Article 23(d) of the Hague Regulations prohibits declaring that no quarter will be given. Article 40 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions states, "It is prohibited to order that there shall be no survivors, to threaten an adversary therewith, or to conduct hostilities on this basis." A no-quarter order would be a war crime under international law. It would require combatants to kill enemy forces who wish to surrender or are incapacitated, rather than accepting their surrender. Vindman's reference to the Secretary of Defense this weekend, making statements about no quarter, no survivors, would refer to public comments by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. If the Secretary of Defense publicly advocated for no quarter, no survivors policies, this would represent advocacy for war crimes. General Donovan's response that no such order has been issued, that is no, and that he is personally responsible for upholding the core principles of necessity, distinction, personality, and humanity, references the fundamental principles of the law of armed conflict. These LOAC principles require that any force used must be necessary to achieve a legitimate military objective. Combatants must distinguish between military objectives and civilians or civilian objects. Incidental civilian harm must not be excessive compared to the anticipated military advantage. This is the principle of proportionality, which the general may have referenced as personality. Finally, the principle of humanity requires that unnecessary suffering must be avoided. When Vindman asked directly whether a no quarter, no mercy order is lawful or unlawful, General Donovan stated, "I would not follow an unlawful order," rather than directly stating such an order would be unlawful. This careful phrasing, while avoiding directly contradicting his civilian leadership, effectively confirmed that he would not execute such an order. Vindman's concluding statement, "Well, that's an unlawful order," represented his legal assessment as a former JAG officer that no quarter orders violate the law of armed conflict and constitute war crimes. The hearing raised fundamental questions about the legal framework governing military operations against drug trafficking organizations and whether those operations comply with the law of armed conflict. The statistics Vindman cited, 45 strikes, 157 killed, 47 vessels destroyed, only 2 survivors, if accurate, represent an extraordinarily low survival rate that prompted questions about whether no quarter policies are being implemented despite being unlawful under international humanitarian law. General Donovan confirmed no quarter, no survivors order has been issued and stated he would not follow unlawful orders, effectively confirming such orders violate the law of armed conflict. What remains unresolved is whether operational practices, regardless of formal orders, result in outcomes consistent with no quarter policies, and whether the Secretary of Defense's public statements advocating such approaches represent official policy or rhetorical excess. We cover congressional oversight and military law. Subscribe for more coverage like this.